go ahead to the next session, which is the last session for today. And it starts with chairpersons. The chairpersons are Dr. Sishish Chandan, Dr. Mohit Goel, Dr. Vivek Kumar, Dr. Jyoti Garg. So I hope they are there. I welcome them all and request them to take over the session now. Dr. Jyoti, unmute.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to, though it's very late now, the session is going on late. I would like to call upon the first speaker, Professor Vinay Goel. Everybody is well versed with Professor Vinay Goel. He is a known figure in neurology, especially in movement disorders. And so he's recently joined Medanta Hospital. He is director there, and I will call upon Professor Vinay Goel to speak on the topic genetics of Parkinson's disease.
No. Spasmodic dysphonia.
So just a minute. Actually, the this is not visible.
Okay, it is a. I will tell you. It is
you would be
spasmodic
on
dysphonia
toxin.
And difficult cervical dystonia. How do I inject Botox? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jyoti, for the introduction. Thank you, Dr. Achal and Professor Padma for inviting me for this talk. I've been given now 10 minutes rather than 12 minutes and to speak on botulinum toxin in spasmodic dysphonia as well as cervical dystonia will be, I think, let me try because I don't take even that smaller time to inject in a patient. And now I've been asked to deliver a talk on this. Anyway, let me see. So don't complain if I have got very simplistic slide because keeping in mind that I'm very short of time. I bring greetings from Medanta and I have no disclosures. So as all of you know, botulinum toxin is indicated in a large number of movement disorder and non-movement disorders. And today's interest will be cervical dystonia and spasmodic dysphonia. So I'm going to start with spasmodic dysphonia because that's area of my interest. This 400 years ago was diagnosed as, psychogenic disorder, but because sometimes the people cannot speak, but they can sing, or they can speak in a different pitch. So that was very surprising, and that's how they were diagnosed that these are psychotic disorders. But now we know that these are well-known described dystonia of vocal cord, what we call laryngeal dystonias. So if you have to describe laryngeal dystonia, then when laryngeal dystonia can happen? When you're talking, or there are two functions of vocal cord. Either they are used during breathing or during talking. So during phonation, what can happen? Either vocal cords can come closer, what we call adductor spasmodic dysphonia, or they can get separated, then we can call abductor spasmodic dysphonia. What happened during breathing? Usually it is during inspiration. When I'm trying to breathe in, the vocal cord should open rather than they get closed and produce a condition which is called adductor laryngeal breathing dysphonia. And when I show you this, I'm sure you will recognize, you have seen these patients. It's very easy to treat them with botulinum toxin, but they never get diagnosed. So this is a kind of just a representative slide of vocal cord. These are the important muscle which we require to inject. This is the anterior part of the throat, and this is the posterior part of the throat. So from anteriorly, as you could see, this is the location of thyroid retinoid muscle. So from midline, if you take 2 millimeter on either side and go 45 degree or around 30 to 45 degree oblique, you will reach this muscle. Whereas posterior cricothyroid muscle is actually, it's this portion of this. And so it's very different. I'll show you how we inject if the time will permit. So let's look into some of the videos. Is this sound audible? Can somebody confirm? Is this sound audible?
No, sir. No, sir.
No, sir.
No, sir.
No?
No.
Oh. This is the patient. Listen to the sound.
Huge bay, weakness bay, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
So if I imitate this patient, this is a patient of adductor spasmodic dysphonia. So when I'm trying to, if the vocal cord will adduct, then I will have a strained voice. So voice will be something like to Monday, Tuesday. And when I say that, I'm sure you must have heard people speaking in this kind of language. When their voice looks strangulated, these are the patients who have voice tremor. Their voice looks very difficult to speak. And uncommonly, some of the patient may also have associated breathing problem. So let's look at more complicated case. Listen to this.
एक दो तीन चार
This was one of the worst adductor spasmodic dysphonia where I could see when he was trying to speak, he was barely able to speak. So he barely was able to speak because the vocal cord would choke so badly and he will get breathless. So what are the options? You could do speech therapy, psychotherapy, a large number of things you can do. But I think to my understanding, the best thing which works is botulinum toxin for injecting in these patients. So how to select? I think the most important thing is clinical diagnosis. I always teach my resident, listen to the voice and then diagnose. So clinical diagnosis is must. Every case of spasmodic dysphonia should be evaluated by ENT specialist because some of the common condition as common as vocal nodule can mimic exactly like spasmodic dysphonia, and you cannot inject a patient like this. So a basic ENT evaluation is required. You have to discuss the outcome in every patient because this is a very tricky injection, and those who injected large number of patients with spasmodic dysphonia will agree with me that it doesn't look very simple and rosy. I have worst of the complication I have seen with this injection. I must have injected some 300, 400 injections till now, and the worst which can happen, which happened to one of my patients, was who was a very dear friend's brother-in-law, that he had complete loss of speech. So which is quite possible, and I explained them very well in advance that very uncommonly. So this is almost one patient in last 500,000 patients whichever I injected and who had complete loss of speech for about 3 weeks. Other uncommon things are sometimes after some time they complain when they cough there is a tinge of blood, which is possible. Sometimes you're too deep and you are submucosal, that can lead to a small bleed in the vocal cord and they can come out with this. Expected outcome has to be different. So I say about 10% of the patient may not have a good outcome because of the various reasons. I would say the commonest poor outcome is they may not have any effect. The reason for not having any effect is either you have not taken adequate dose or you have not reached the right muscle, because sometimes in a thick people with thick neck, it is very difficult to negotiate to the muscle. This is a classical botulinum toxin myajefinatil which we use. This is the landmark. So if I should have put a drawing of the previous one. So this is a cricothyroid membrane. This is thyroid cartilage. This is Adam's apple. So feel Adam's apple. Bring your finger down, and the first space what you feel is cricothyroid membrane. So put a midline point, and there are 2 millimeter on either side. You can draw a vertical line. Then go puncture here and go 45-degree lateral and deep, and that's how you will reach about 3/4 of a centimeter distance to half centimeter distance, depending on the thickness of the neck. You will reach the muscle, and then you ask him to say E. When you say E, the vocal cord will close, and if your muscle needle is right into the muscle, there will be a burst you can hear on the EMG. So this is the location where you could see this needle is going here. This is in a different direction. So this is from lateral position, and this is actually a repetition of same diagram. So let's see how we do it. So could you appreciate there was a burst of sound when he said E? Just listen again. So your ears has to be tuned to listen to the sound, because when you're injecting, your eyes are glued to the area of the injection, so you cannot divert yourself to see the burst in the EMG. But if you're tuned to it, then you will be able to listen to this sound, and then you can inject. I usually take about 1 ml of syringe. I take normal dosing on one side is 3 to 5 unit. I start with 3 unit on one side, and 3 unit on other side. So that becomes 6 unit. I dilute into 1 ml volume of normal saline and get zero point 0.5 on one side and zero point 0.5 on the other side. This is basic standard I start with. But I've gone even up to as high as about 8 units on one side, or 16 unit in one of the severe most cases. But I would never ask you to do it until unless you are really expert to do this. So listen to the same patient, look at the voice.
Day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, February, March,
And
April.
this is the my time is up, so I think I'll take only spasmodic dysphonia and stop because we are already running too much late. Same patient after injection.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. January, February, March.
I'm sure you'll appreciate the effort of speaking has significantly gone down, but still I can appreciate the quality of the speech is not as clear as normal. So still, I think he's training while speaking. So this is another patient. Pre
एक, दो, तीन, चार, पाँच, छः, सात.
appreciate he has to make a great effort to speak. That's what is adductor dysphonia about.
Tuesday, Wednesday, February, March, April, May, June, July, August.
So there is very clearly decrease in the effort of speaking. So let's. I think this video is corrupted and that's why it's not moving. I'll go to the next slide rather than coming to the same slide and stopping it here. So let's look at patient with adductor spasmodic dystonia, and now it is abductor. So when they are speaking, so what do you hear? This is the patient of Professor Bihari, as you could see her sound. So when he's trying to speak, if I'm trying to speak and if my vocal cords separate, so when I'm trying to speak, so it's a hollow speech. So the words don't come and they become hollow. So listen to him again. There is a phenomenon in this abductor type of spasmodic dysphonia. When the vocal cord go apart, the vocal cord thyroid net muscles try to compensate. So suddenly, when they are trying to speak, there is a hoarseness. So when trying to speak, suddenly there is a hoarseness. So this is the compensative phenomena. So what sometimes people call it as a mixed spasmodic dysphonia. So this is also a possible thing. When you have a phenomena like this, it will be difficult to decide to inject both the posterior cricothyroid muscle or one cricothyroid muscle. Let's listen to another voice. Initially, we'll see the voice looks quite okay, but listen to her.
So we are unable to see your video.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
You're not able to see?
your screen is not being shared.
Oh my God.
We can see you.
Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Visible now?
Yeah, we can see you now.
Now videos are visible.
Okay, so see this video.
English video.
Stop this. Listen to the
एक
lady.
2 3 4 5 6 7
Till now
8
it looks okay.
9 10
Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, fast होली.
संडे मंडे ट्यूसडे थर्सडे वेडनेसडे फ्राइडे सैटरडे
से क्या तकलीफ है आपको?
आवाज साफ निकलती
साफ निकलती है. क्या होता है?
कुछ
So
वर्ड्स
after speaking for some time,
हवा
you
निकल
could
जाती
see
है.
that her
कब
voice
से
becomes
बोली?
hollow. This is another problem. Sometimes patient is complaining that I have got a voice problem, but when you examine, you may not see that. I remember a patient who had classical history, which looked like adductor spasmodic dysphonia, which are almost 90-95% of the patient of total spasmodic dysphonia. But I don't hear his voice, which was so I asked him to sit there and to keep talking to his friend in my OPD. And after about 15 minutes, when they were talking, he started having a strained voice. There's another condition which I mentioned you was adductor laryngeal breathing dystonia. Listen to the voice. बताइए क्या तकलीफ है?
तकलीफ यही है कि सांस लेते हैं ना ऊपर लाते हैं तो आप सांस आता नहीं है, आवाज खूब होता है, बेचैनी बहुत है।
और क्या तकलीफ है?
यही
That's
तकलीफ और कुछ हमको तकलीफ।
So what's happening here is when she's trying to breathe in, the vocal cord gets close. I've seen patients with this adductor laryngeal breathing dystonia. If you look at the vocal cord of a normal person, they put a video laryngoscope. The moment they start speaking, vocal cord open like this. But in this cases, the vocal cord remains shut for a fraction of a second of time and then start opening gradually. That's the time they produce a sound like this.
तकलीफ यही है, कोई तकलीफ
आंख बंद होती हो जोर से, गर्दन मुड़ती हो चलने चलने में,
जब ये होता है ना आंख ऐसे
हो जाती है। जब होता है तभी होती है, इसके अलावा नहीं होती है।
नहीं, कभी कभी ऐसी हो जाता है।
होती है जब चलने में गर्दन टेढ़ी एक तरफ हो जाती है, ऐसा
नहीं, गर्दन जब ये खिंचाता है ना तब गर्दन टेढ़ा आ जाता है।
कैसी होती है करके दिखाओ, कैसी हो जाती है टेढ़ी ऐसे?
कोई तकलीफ
आंख बंद होती हो जोर से, गर्दन मुड़ती हो चलने चलने में,
लगभग 8-9 मिनट।
इसके अलावा कोई तकलीफ? So what happens if I imitate whenever we normally are speaking, you do not hear the sound of breathe in when you are speaking. In this patient, because the vocal cords don't open adequately, so the breathing time in between, suddenly when I breathe in, I'll make a sound like so because the vocal cord don't open. This is called adductor laryngeal breathing dysphonia. I remember at the beginning of my career, so 15 years ago, there was a lady who had a severe adductor laryngeal breathing dystonia. And she was referred from Kanpur, and then because she had difficulty in breathing also, so she was intubated. Later on, she underwent tracheostomy and went off. So, and it was very disappointing. And when I learned about this condition, then I realized, my God, this patient lady has unnecessarily gone tracheostomy. And I reviewed literature that a large number of patients have died because of this condition. Large number of patients have underwent tracheostomy because they couldn't be diagnosed. But the treatment is very simple, that you could inject a small dose into thyroid, the way I showed you in the previous slide, and if these patients become so well. So I think I'll stop it here because of the shortage of time, and we are all running late. So maybe I will cover this next topic sometime when I get a chance to present. Thank you very much, Dr. Achal.
Thank you, sir, for this informative lecture. Now I would call upon Dr. Sumit. I would like to invite Dr. Sumit Singh.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think by this time everybody is already going to have a headache, and the only thing is how severe the headache is. So I'll take just 5 minutes to tell you how I treat a case of refractory chronic headache. So obviously one has to understand that history is the most important thing. So I always say that if you have 10 minutes to spend with your headache patient, spend 9.5 minutes on history, 30 seconds on examination, and write the investigations in the remaining 15 seconds. How the headache started, what was the frequency, what was the pattern, what was the duration of headache, which was the site, intensity, nature of the pain, were there any predisposing factors, triggering factors, aggravating or relieving factors, family history was there or not, how does the patient respond during these headaches, and how does the patient behave between the headache episodes is also important. So the difficult to control headaches are probably going to be the issue which we are going to discuss here. So I feel that almost all headaches respond to treatment, and it has to be importantly understood that the expectations of the patients need to be addressed. If a headache is not responding to the treatment, then there are only two possibilities. It's actually a case which has been referred to you by your worst enemy, and it's actually a difficult case, or it's actually a rare headache syndrome which you're not familiar with. So in that case, you refer him to your worst enemy. So I'm going to give an illustrative case who was a 49-year-old male who was an orthopedic surgeon from Rajasthan who had headache from 1984. It was unilateral, switching sides, severe, and it was incapacitating. He could not perform his activities of daily living during the headache, and he considered that he is a doctor himself, so he did not consult any physician. And some of his seniors asked him to take paracetamol with 5 milligrams of diazepam twice to thrice in a month. And therefore, he just did not took any prophylaxis. So in his internship, his night duties started. At that time, his headache worsened. He started to consume pethidine and Phenargan because it was freely available in the emergency. And then one of his seniors, considered that it might be required that he might be put on propranolol, and he improved. And eventually, he was wise enough to be dedicated for opiates. Then once he was finished with his orthopedics post-graduation, he started a self-centered orthopedics clinic and then a nursing home. He took a loan, and then for his stress worsened, the headache worsened. So he started increasing usage of oral medications, and most of them were non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Occasionally, he used to take tramadol. He self-medicated with beta blockers, divalproex, flunarizine, but he never continued on a regular basis. His headache frequency increased gradually, and so did the headache medications. And for the last 8 years, he started taking ergots and triptans at will. For the last 5 years, his headache was almost every day. It was moderate in severity and intensity and bearable with severe episodes which used to occur 3 to 4 times a week. His triptan and ergot or both consumption increased to 3 to 4 tablets of each for last 3 years on almost a weekly basis. And there was obviously an exponential increase in headache severity and frequency. And then he resorted to injectables. For last 2 years, his headache was very, very severe, every day without fail, severe and incapacitating, and it was restricting his activities as a surgeon. Headache used to start from the back of the neck on either side, usually from the right side, did not have nausea or vomiting, no photophobia, phonophobia. It radiated from the back to the temples on both the sides, and it was associated with a very poor sleep. He was depressed and could not function as a doctor. At the time when he presented to us, his consumption was topiramate 100 milligrams twice a day, amitriptyline 75 milligrams once in the night, gabapentin 400 milligrams thrice a day, duloxetine 30 milligrams twice a day. And look at his analgesic consumption. He used to inject tramadol 100 milligrams 6 hourly, perfalgan twice a day, Fortwin and Phenargan twice to thrice a week, and sumatriptan 25 milligrams thrice a day, and Vesogran SOS. So this is undoubtedly the most severe headache syndrome which I have seen in my life. And above medications were there, but he was severely distressed and depressed. He had taken injection Botox 100 units about a month back, but it was not working out. And every single vein in his extremity had thrombophlebitis. There was an extensive ulcerations in the legs due to chronic venous insufficiency. And this guy was actually a national level badminton player. And when he came to me, his both legs were as if he had got elephantiasis. There was no peripheral vein which we could give an injection to in the upper limbs or the lower limbs. And actually, we had to resort to a central line. His legs were about thrice the normal size that I already told you. And his examination was perfectly normal, and there was no papilledema. He had chronic anemia of iron deficiency. There was raised creatinine, probably because of NSAID consumption. MRI was normal. Venous sinuses were normal in the brain, but there was chronic venous thrombosis in both the legs and all the superficial veins. Now, this was a headache for a headache doctor. So what did we do? We admitted for detoxification because he was clearly a case of medication overuse with chronic migraine. We had to actually put in a central line because peripheral line was not, observable. We gave him sodium valproate, dexamethasone, pantoprazole, and nursing staff was instructed that under no circumstances we are going to give any sort of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or painkiller to him. and it was only with direct discussion with me that this was permitted. As I've already told you, this was the time and this was the treatment which we gave it to him. Over the next 3 days, his requirement of analgesics reduced. We gave him an occipital nerve block. A trial block was very, very effective for 24 hours, and it was the first time in last 6 years that he did not require a painkiller. And then what we did was we did a radio frequency ablation, and he stayed headache free. And for last I think after we gave him a radio frequency ablation of his greater occipital nerves on both the sides, he was headache free for almost a year. And in 6 months later, he had a mild recurrence of headaches. He came to us and he did not, respond to a repeat occipital nerve block. So we had to give him an occipital nerve stimulation. So these are extremely, extremely rare headaches where, once you have excluded the secondary causes and you are sure that this is a primary headache, and if the patient has chronic headache and it's a long lasting headache, then what we call would be a chronic migraine. And the type of analgesic consumption which this guy had was a chronic migraine with analgesic overuse headache. So normally we treat these patients with various permutations and combinations, detoxification of their medication. But sometimes we have to resort to such extreme treatment options like occipital nerve stimulation, which was the only thing which was working for this patient. And I've been in follow-up with this guy for almost like 3.5 years, 4 years now, and he is very well controlled with occipital nerve stimulation. So if we look at patients who have chronic headaches, then they could have chronic migraine, hemicrania continua, New Delhi persistent headache, and chronic tension type headaches. Now, hemicrania continua responds very well to indomethacin. New Delhi persistent headache is a decisively poor headache which will not respond to most treatment options, but topiramate and botulinum toxin you might help. Now, the second option is that you might have actually a headache which is a very, very rare headache, like patients with trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias and other primary headache syndromes. Now, the trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias are rare headache syndromes, and of them, there is one condition which is called as SUNCT, which is sudden unilateral, short-lasting unilateral headaches with conjunctival tearing and irrigation. Now, normally SUNCT is a very, very rare headache disorder, and you might occasionally have a patient who has got very, very severe SUNCTs, and once in a lifetime, you might find a patient who has got a SUNCT status. So this is one patient who was with us, and he had a status SUNCT, and you can see his condition at the time when he has the headache, and you can see that there is a nasal discharge, and there's a ocular discharge, and there's a redness of his eyes. And this guy was having 50 to 60 headache episodes every single day without fail, and he was miserable in his condition. We tried lamotrigine, we tried topiramate, we tried palatine ganglion block, but nothing worked in this particular patient. And eventually we had, and it was for the first time, I mean, I did not give it, but it was my colleague, Dr. Manish Mahajan, whose patient this is. He had to give a lignocaine infusion to this patient, and you can see that this patient is a completely changed person after lignocaine infusion. And he's not had any headache in the last 72 hours after this lignocaine infusion was given to him. So in order to conclude, I would like to say that if you have a patient with chronic headache, then patience is undoubtedly the key. Spend 95% of the time in the history, don't miss the red flags, and the associated features of the headache might help in the diagnosis and deciding the treatment. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Sir, for this wonderful lecture. Now I would be inviting Dr. Professor Achal Srivastava for lecture on dissecting adult leukodystrophies. He's professor, he's in AIMS and backbone of this conference. Dr. Achal, please.
Thank you, Jyoti. I hope the slides are visible. Okay. So I thank all of you being there so much. It's too late in the night and all of you are there. Still, we have great attendance. I will not disclose, but it is beyond 50. So we go into the topic dissecting adult leukodystrophies. And we will be taking a few topics only in this: definition, classification, diagnostic algorithm, and some of the case vignettes which my senior resident Dr. Sita will present. So leukodystrophies are actually a diverse group of neurodegenerative disorders. Actually, they have white matter lesion. There is a very wide spectrum and there is a lot of phenotypic variation. On many occasions, it is very difficult to diagnose and often misdiagnosed because there are various types of presentations. Some of the early onset presentations may also be seen as late onset. The course of the disease is very insidious and very often the diagnosis is very difficult, delayed. The diseases are very rare and often there is overlap in the presentations. There is variability in the single disease presentation as well. And moreover, as soon as you do the MRI, there is a big challenge which appears to sort the MRI to think of a particular disease. White matter lesions, mysterious lesions, and all those things. And there is a pressing need to distinguish from treatable acquired conditions. If we talk of definition of leukodystrophy, Wanderknapp, who have done a lot of work on this particular subject, came out in this publication in 2016. Leukodystrophies are currently defined as, rather it's a pathological definition, as all genetically determined disorders primarily affecting central nervous system white matter, irrespective of the structural white matter component involved, the molecular process affected, and the disease course. So it is rather a pathological description. So these leukodystrophies were recently redefined, I will say, as heritable disorders affecting the white matter of the central nervous system, sharing glial cell or myelin sheath abnormalities, the neuropathology of which is primarily characterized by involvement of oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, and other non-neuronal cell types. Although in many disorders, the mechanism of disease remains greatly unknown, and in other cases, it is suspected to include significant axonal pathology. Based on all this, Wanderknapp again proposed a classification which appeared in 2017 Acta Neuropathologica. This classification you can see here: myelin disorders, astrocytopathies, leukoaxonopathies, microgliopathies, and leukovasculopathies. Again, more of looking like pathological classification. Various disorders which fall into these 5 categories you can see here. I will not go into the detail because of shortage of time. Now this is another classification based on age of onset, childhood onset and adult onset. Adult onset we consider here more than 16-year age. So various disorders, many of them we are aware, we must have seen in our lives. The adult onset, more than 16-year cases: Krebs disease, myeloleukodystrophy, adrenoleukodystrophy, Alexander leukodystrophy, CTX, HDLS, and CADASILs, ADLD. We come to when to suspect adult onset leukodystrophy. First, you have to see into the presentation. There are neuropsychiatric symptoms, and it is followed by gait difficulties, maybe of spasticity type or ataxia type. Then there is impaired coordination and dysarthria. We must look into the family history, consanguinity, look into the extra neurologic features like adrenal insufficiency, xanthomas. And again, as I said earlier, the mysterious white matter lesions, where you need to sort out what kind of leukodystrophy it is. there is subacute course, and often there are risk factors which are absent. So various white matter lesions, you have got an MR. Now your first round starts here. You have to exclude acquired conditions, also treatable conditions. Consider an adult onset leukodystrophy. You look into the family history, ethnicity, clinical history examination, then MRI pattern, then go into the next round 2. You do some required or I will say pinpointed biochemical or ancillary tests. And even then it is not found, then you go into the genetic test, round 3. And last step is brain biopsy, even if the genetic test has failed. So I will not discuss all the tests here, round 1. And this is a exhaustive list of various leukodystrophies. It came into 2 slides at least, and that too you can see the font size is hardly 5/8. So clinical features associated with adult onset leukodystrophies. You can see here that again, it helps you in pinpointing a particular type of leukodystrophy. Visual involvement, neurological features, specific neurological features like neuropathy, cerebral ataxia, psychiatric symptoms. To much extent, you can pinpoint. If there is more of pyramidal weakness, bulbar dysfunction, all those other features like primary or secondary amenorrhea, microcephaly, tendon xanthomas, all these are features which point towards some particular etiology. So we have step-by-step approach for imaging as well. Step 1, identify symmetric white matter involvement, look for a white matter involvement pattern, and then recognize distinctive features. So for that, you must know what are various MRI patterns, frontal pattern, parieto-occipital pattern, periventricular pattern, subcortical pattern, and in somewhere there is brainstem involvement as well, cerebral involvement also. So by this you can see into the slide. I will not discuss in great detail, but you by knowing all this, you can again pinpoint a particular etiology. Step 3. Again, some of the lesions with CSF signal intensity, susceptibility signal abnormalities, then enhancements, abnormal peaks on MR spectroscopy, spinal cord involvement. You come into a specific biochemical test as required by your suspicion, ancillary tests, and as I said earlier, genetic tests. Then you must have an eye on treatable leukodystrophies. These are some of the dystrophies where you can do something. Now I'll request Sita Lakshmi to come over and present some of the cases.
Good evening, respected teachers and colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank Achal sir for providing me this opportunity and this prestigious platform. So before wasting time, I'm proceeding with the case vignettes. So this is a 58-year-old male with a 3-year history of progressive unsteady gait. Examination revealed UMN signs in both the lower limbs with deep tendon reflexes, equivocal plantar, and Romberg sign and loss of posterior column sensation. So clinically, we have a patient with chronic progressive spastic paraparesis with possible neuropathy, and his MRA showed multiple T2 hyperintensities in the parieto-occipital region and spinal cord atrophy, which I'll be showing in the subsequent slide. Following imaging showed progression of his lesions. So patient 2 is his younger sibling. He is a 49-year-old male with more or less a similar history with 10 years history of difficulty in walking. His examination as well revealed spastic paraparesis and sensory polyneuropathy. MRI findings were a single large T2 hyperintensity spanning the anterior aspect of the corpus callosum as well as significant atrophy of the spinal cord. So this is his MRA of the first patient, showing the image on the left is T2, axial T2 showing symmetric, confluent T2 hyperintensities in the parieto-occipital region, and the same area in T1 contrast shows contrast enhancement, especially in the periphery. So this is the sagittal spinal cord T2 section, which shows significant atrophy of the cord, which you can see especially in the dorsal cord. So syndromically, we have a patient with myeloneuropathy. So we are left with endless differential diagnosis. So we will try to use the algorithm which sir has already explained. So we have a patient with MRI showing white matter lesions which are symmetric. First of all, we will do round one of investigations to exclude mainly the acquired and treatable conditions. So thereafter, an adult onset leukodystrophy is being considered. So in this particular case, a family history is contemplated because we have a patient with his male sibling affected. It could be an autosomal dominant and or an X-linked pattern of inheritance. There is no specific ethnicity mentioned. So specific neurological, eye and systemic and skin examination can be looked for any features of Addisonian syndrome. And MRI shows a posterior, especially parieto-occipital pattern of signal changes with enhancement. So we proceeded with the biochemical and ancillary tests, which showed a raised very long chain fatty acid. This confirms a diagnosis of adrenoleukodystrophy. So coming to the case 2, this is a case from our center. He's Mr. APS. He's a 50-year-old male with 10 years history of progressive spastic paraparesis with bladder involvement. And he has low and stalking pattern of paresthesias in the lower limb. And he has been wheelchair bound for after 7 years of onset of the illness. And his mother, maternal uncle, and grandmother they have gait disturbances. His vitals were normal, cognitively he was sound, and all his dependent reflexes were brisk except the angiojet, which was absent. And the plantar left side was extensor. Vibration sense was impaired till the tibial tuberosity. Here we also, another male, middle-aged male with a chronic spastic paraparesis with possible neuropathy and with a possible family history, which could be an autosomal dominant inheritance. This is a MRI which showed symmetric signal changes in the middle cerebellar peduncle. And his MRI brain shows symmetric confluent diffuse white matter changes as well. So this is a spinal cord MRI sagittal view, which shows diffuse atrophy of the cord, as well as you can see in the upper part, the entire brainstem is atrophied. So we proceeded with the initial round 1 and round 2 investigations were inconclusive. So we proceeded with the round 3 genetic test, which showed microduplication in the lamin B1 and MARCH3 genes. So this confirms adult onset autosomal dominant leukodystrophy, ADLD. So now I'm coming to certain characteristic MRI findings in certain leukodystrophies. This is MRI of metachromatic leukodystrophy. Here we can see symmetric, confluent, periventricular white matter hyperintensities with a frontal predominance. Usually this pairs subcortical U fibers, and in some cases we can see a tigroid pattern. So this is an imaging feature of Krabbe disease. Krabbe disease, just like adrenoleukodystrophy, it has posterior predominant, especially parieto-occipital T2 flash signal changes can be seen. In this case, additionally in the image, the middle image, there is atrophy of the corpus callosum and also volume loss in the corticospinal tract. So adult polyglucosan body disease is another rare leukodystrophy where we can see there is confluent and diffuse signal changes in the brain, as well as there is atrophy of the brainstem and upper spinal cord. So this is a boy with bulbar involvement, recent onset of bulbar involvement, and on examination, he has this typical finding, which is a palatal myoclonus. So MRI finding in Alexander disease, there is atrophy of the brainstem, especially the medulla, as well as the spinal cord. And also Alexander disease has a anterior predominant involvement. Anterior, that is a frontal white matter is involved. So MRI feature of cerebrotendinous xanthomatosis. Here we have, there is classically T2 signal low intensity in the dentate nucleus. So vanishing white matter disease, MRI finding is there is diffuse involvement, and there will be, at the final stage, there will be thinning out of the entire white matter. So the learning points from this lecture is all white matter lesions are not leukodystrophies. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. Essentially, we have to rule out common and treatable mimics. and diagnosis should be done in appropriate clinical and imaging context with confirmatory tests if available or feasible, and targeted gene sequencing are cost effective. And we have to screen the family members, as well as we have to prognosticate, and appropriate counseling should be given. So this slide summarizes the entire talk. Suspected, in a case of suspected adult onset leukodystrophy, first see for in a typical presentation, see for the MRI pattern, then other helpful radiological features, then see for other suggestive clinical features for a potential diagnostic clue, see useful biochemical tests, focus tests, genetic testing wherever feasible, and consider brain biopsy when there is a rapid progression and all the other invasive workup remains negative and a treatable etiology is contemplated. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, Jyoti, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, now
Go
I
to the
would,
next presentation. Yeah.
yes, sir. I would invite Dr. Anu Gupta. She is Assistant Professor in Neurology at AIIMS, and she would be presenting on pathognomic neuro-ophthalmology findings. Now you see it, now you know it. Dr. Anu, please.
Thank
Dr.
you,
Anu?
ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Please share your screen.
Yeah. Thanks to the chairpersons and the organizing committee for this opportunity. So I will be talking about some pathognomic neuro-ophthalmology findings. So neuro-ophthalmological examination is, I would say, one of the most precise and refined parts of clinical examinations in neurology. And done properly, it can elicit certain findings which can help in an accurate localization in the
Sorry, ma'am.
neurons.
Please open your PPT.
Are my slides not visible?
No, no. I think minimize.
Are they visible now?
No, ma'am.
Few parts are visible, videos are on display, but
Please share again, ma'am.
Is it now visible?
no.
No, ma'am.
I'll share it again.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it now visible?
No, ma'am.
No, still not
I
visible.
think minimize हो गया आपका वो उसको
Okay.
ओपन हो गया ना minimize हो
On
गया.
my screen, it's coming as a
मैम इसको minimize कर दीजिए इस विंडो को minimize कर दीजिए.
the PPT.
नहीं नहीं जो दूसरा विंडो आ रहा है आपके सारे फाइल पड़े हुए इसमें.
Your videos are displayed.
मैम पहले पीपीटी को फुल कर दीजिए उसके बाद आप जूम विंडो पे जाके क्लिक कीजिए फिर शेयर कीजिए.
Now is my screen desktop visible?
नहीं मैम डेस्कटॉप आ रहा है पीपीटी नहीं ओपन. हाँ जी.
Abhi?
नहीं नहीं आया.
Now?
ना. ये पीपीटी मिनिमाइज हो रखा है मैम सिर्फ आपका ये डेस्कटॉप आ रहा है.
But the PPT is showing on my screen.
मैम आप पहले शेयर कीजिए एक बार शेयर कीजिए और सिलेक्ट कीजिए पीपीटी को.
Just a second.
हाँ जी शेयर कीजिए और क्या ऑप्शन आ रहा है.
Sharing screen.
हाँ जी क्या ऑप्शन आ रहा है.
Whiteboard and my folder DNA con 20.
नहीं नहीं, तो व्हाइट बोर्ड आ रहा है ना। अब एक काम कीजिए पहले।
Now finder आ रहा है DNA con 21.
नहीं 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 मैम, एक काम कीजिए, ये आप
डॉक्टर अनु,
Yes.
पीपीटी
हाँ,
को
पहले
आप
आप है ना,
खोल कीजिए,
स्लाइड-
पीपीटी को
एक
खोल
मिनट,
लीजिए पहले आप।
स्लाइड शेयर हटा दो। नहीं, स्लाइड शेयर हटाओ पहले आप।
Okay.
अभी
ठीक
शेयर
है,
नहीं किया।
स्लाइड शेयर हटा के गो नाउ मिनिमाइज द जूम।
Okay.
Now go to the screen and see, is your PPT visible there?
My folder is visible and now PPT is also visible.
नहीं नहीं, PPT के अलावा बाकी सारे फोल्डर को मिनिमाइज कर लो आप पहले। तो डेस्कटॉप पे सिर्फ PPT खुलाओ, बाकी सब मिनिमाइज कर लीजिए।
Okay.
ठीक है, नाउ यू ओपन योर जूम एंड नाउ डू दिस शेयर स्क्रीन, तो आपका PPT दिख जाएगा वहां पे।
Now is it visible, sir?
यस
Great, आ गया। Yes, perfect.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
So I was saying that it helps in not only in localization at the neuraxis, but also in narrowing down the etiological differential. And sometimes it may point towards an accurate underlying systemic cause. So if we carefully go through all the steps of a neuro-ophthalmic examination, including visual inspection, inspection of the pupils, the afferent visual pathway, the extraocular movements, and ocular oscillations, we may encounter these findings at different steps. And I'll be sharing some of the representative examples, although this may not be an exhaustive collection, but try to cover some important ones. So we've all seen this and we all know about this. This is a no-brainer. We can see brownish green discoloration in the cornea, and this is due to copper deposition in the Descemet's membrane of cornea. It is a case of Fleischer ring. It's seen in it starts in the superior pole, and it is seen in 95% of patients seen in Wilson's disease, and seen in 95% of these patients who have neurological manifestations. Rarely it may be seen in other disorders like primary biliary cirrhosis, intraocular copper found bodies, or chronic cholestasis. In the same cartoon, we can see, in the same photograph, we can see another finding, which is a sunflower cataract. So this is due to copper deposition in the lens capsule. And this also has differentials like primary biliary cirrhosis and some hereditary disorders where there is hyperferritinemia and deposition of ferritin. So this is another case, a 14-year-old girl who came with a 6 years history of pancerebellar ataxia. There was a marked cerebellar atrophy on the MRI brain, and she also had a sensory motor axonal neuropathy. So if we look at the eye, the conjunctiva is showing telangiectatic vessels. So these were ocular telangiectasias, and these bulbar conjunctival vessels, which are dilated, can be seen. They appear at around 4 to 7 years of age. They first appear on the lateral side, followed by the medial side, and are seen in 91% of cases of ataxia telangiectasia. A close differential of such cases is a Sturge-Weber syndrome. But in a Sturge-Weber syndrome, the dilated vessels are actually angiomas and are mostly unilateral. And they're also associated with choroidal angiomas and glaucoma. Sometimes a low flow dural shunt can also lead to dilated vessels in the bulbar conjunctiva. So this patient came with, was an immunocompetent guy who came with a young patient who came with history of seizures, cognitive decline, and headaches. And you can see there was a fluctuant nodule, which was episcleral, and there's another nodule in the lower eyelid. And he had multiple such nodules in the different subcutaneous tissues and a starry sky appearance on the MRI brain. So this was a case of disseminated cysticercosis. So coming to the examination of the pupils. So if we look at this cartoon, if we look at the pupils in the room light, we can see that the right pupil is larger in size as compared to the left. On exposing these eyes to bright light, the left one constricts, but the right does not. It remains dilated. But On a near stimulus, the right one also slowly constricts. And on using a dilute pilocarpine, there is a robust constriction of the right pupil. So this is an Addy's tonic pupil. In an Addy's tonic pupil, we have a unilateral abnormally dilated pupil which does not constrict to light. It slowly constricts during a near response and redilates slowly upon the object removal. That is why we call it as a tonic pupil. And sometimes on a slit lamp examination, we may find that the paralysis of the iris muscle is segmental. So the healthy tissue still shows contractions, and these may be seen as vermicular contractions. And because the lesion in such cases is peripheral at the level of the ciliary ganglion or in the postganglionic short ciliary nerves, so there is a denervation hypersensitivity. So the pupil constricts even with dilute pilocarpine. So when this Addy's pupil is associated with absent deep tendon jerks, it is Addy's syndrome. And when Addy's syndrome is associated with segmental anhidrosis, it is Ross syndrome. So this is another example of a light near dissociation, but here the pupils are small, both are small, irregular. They do not react to light, but they react briskly to accommodation. So we all know these are Argyll-Robertson pupils, which is considered a pathognomic sign for tertiary syphilis. And the pathophysiology, although is debatable whether it's a central lesion or a peripheral lesion, but then it needs to be differentiated from pseudo-Argyll-Robertson pupil, which can occur in cases of diabetes, Wernicke's encephalopathy, or lesions in the dorsal midbrain. So in pseudo-Argyll-Robertson pupil, the pupils lack meiosis and they are not irregular. So if we look at a differential of light near dissociation, we need to see the pupillary size. If the pupils are small, it's likely small, irregular, it's likely to be an Argyll-Robertson pupil. These pupils have a prompt near response and the lesion is usually central. And if the pupils are dilated, then it could be a pseudo-Argyll-Robertson pupil or an Addy's pupil. An Addy's pupil, 80% cases are unilateral. And as I said, that the near response in such cases is slow, and the dilatation after the removal of the near object or the near target is also slow, and they constrict to dilute pilocarpine. Input failure states can also lead to a kind of light near dissociation, but there is an associated vision loss in such cases. And an aberrant regeneration of the third nerve can also produce a unilateral light near dissociation, but herein we will see ptosis and associated diplopia. So coming to the visual fields. So during a visual field examination, if we find an altitudinal defect in one eye, and that is associated with a sudden onset vision loss, with disc edema, which may be pale, where there may be hemorrhages, which may be sectoral, then we are thinking of an optic nerve pathology, and in such cases, an ischemic optic nerve pathology or an ischemic optic neuropathy is the likely cause. Central scotomas may be seen in both optic nerve and macular diseases. Bitemporal hemianopia is classical for chiasmal lesions. As we move posteriorly, in the posterior visual pathway, although a congruous homonymous hemianopia is usually seen in cortical lesions, but then there are other differentials for this localization. So coming to the fundus examination, in this upper fundus photograph in the panel A, we can see that there is edema of the disc, but there's something else also. If we look carefully, the macula is also involved. The same patient, after a week or so, if you re-examine, develops this macular star. So this is optic disc edema with macular star, and this fluid or this macular star a few weeks later may resolve, leaving these punctate spots and then a pigmentation. So a presence of an optic disc edema with macular star along with subacute vision loss with or without vitreous cells indicates neuroretinitis. So neuroretinitis may be having infective causes and inflammatory etiology, or it may be idiopathic. And close differentials of this state are hypertensive retinopathy, papilledema, diabetic papillopathy. But these conditions are usually bilateral and they are not associated with acute vision loss. Sometimes an ischemic optic neuropathy can also have a macular star, but in an ischemic optic neuropathy, the macular star is usually incomplete. So this again, we've seen it, although we don't see it commonly, but we always look for this finding in cases of a progressive myoclonic epilepsy, or in cases where young patients present with dystonia, ataxia, cognitive decline. So this is a cherry red spot. So a cherry red spot is a bright or dull red spot at the center of the macula, and this is accentuated by the grayish white or yellowish halo of the surrounding retina. So a cherry red spot may be seen in storage disorders. So this is because the fovea lacks the ganglion cell layer, and so due to the infiltration of abnormal of the ganglionic cells by the lipids, abnormal lipid deposition in the surrounding retina, it becomes whitish in color, it loses its transparency, but the foveola, which is lacking the ganglion cell layer, retains its transparency, and so the underlying hue of the choroid is visible as red. Central retinal artery occlusion can also have a cherry red spot, and patients sometimes who have a macular involvement in the form of a macular hole or a macular hemorrhage can have a pseudo cherry red spot. It is called a pseudo cherry red spot because here the primarily involvement is at the foveola, which is abnormal, and the surrounding retina is normal, which is opposite of what is seen in cherry red spot. So this was a patient who had a history of headache, seizures, and vomiting. And you can see a subhyaloid hemorrhage and disc edema in the fundus photograph. And along with this, there is a hemorrhagic infarct in the left temporal lobe and a sigmoid and left sigmoid transverse sinus thrombosis. So this was a case of Terson syndrome. So Terson syndrome is vitreal or subhyaloid hemorrhage, which is secondary to either an acute intracranial hemorrhage or an acute elevated intracranial pressure. And most commonly, it is seen in association with subarachnoid hemorrhage. And it also prognosticates, because when SAH is associated with a Terson syndrome, the chances of mortality are higher. So in this fundus image, if we look at the panel A, we can see that there are hemorrhages, there is sheathing of the vessels, then there is abnormal cutoff of the vessels, then there's a lot of sheathing and exudates, and on fundus fluorescein angiography in the panel C, we can see dye leakage and abrupt cutoff of vessels. So this is the fundus picture of vasculitis. So in this case, both the veins and arteries have been involved. But this patient, in addition to having an acute vision loss and floaters in this involved eye, also had a longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis and some periependymal lesions in the brain. So this patient was worked up for vasculitis, infective causes, malignancies, but he was a young person, a young male, but no clue was found, and he was ultimately diagnosed as Eales disease. So he responded very well to steroids. So Eales disease is basically a usually presents as a perivenulitis. These patients may have recurrent ocular vitreous hemorrhages, and at times they can have neurological manifestations. They've been best described by Professor Singhal and Professor Dastoor in their series of patients in whom they described myelopathy and such kind of brain lesions. Yes. Hello. So if you look at this in the next case, if we look at this image, we can see a hematoma in the right parieto-occipitotemporal region, along with a ventricular hemorrhage and some subdural hematomas. So in the fundus, this patient had an AV malformation. And on DSA, there were AVMs or feeder arteries in the right ophthalmic artery and in the temporal artery. So this was we diagnosed this case as a case of cerebral arteriovenous metameric syndrome. This is a non-hereditary disease. It is unilateral involvement of the cerebral hemisphere, the face, and it can also involve the retina and the eye. So this is of 3 types depending upon what kind of involvement is there. Basically, these AV malformations are seen in the regions of the cerebrum and the face, which originate at the same transverse level or at the same metamere. That is why the name cerebrofacial arteriovenous metameric syndrome. So just by looking at the fundus in a patient who has multiple unilateral hemorrhages, does not have other risk factors, we can look for such a diagnosis. So this patient came with a 10 years history of poor academic performance. He was a young male, 23 years old. And along with this, he had some ataxia, dysarthria, bulbar symptoms. So if we carefully look at the video, his horizontal saccades are normal, horizontal pursuit is normal, vertical pursuit is normal. So the only abnormality is with the vertical saccades. So he has to actually move his head and is not able to initiate vertical saccades. So this patient was actually referred as a case of spinocerebellar ataxia. He had 2 elder siblings who had died of a similar illness in their 20s, and his bone marrow examination revealed storage cells. So he was a case of Niemann-Pick C. So sometimes the pursuit may actually be normal. So it is important to assess the saccades properly, because in the early part of the involvement may only be of saccades rather than the pursuit. So we all know that amongst the lipid storage disorders, a vertical supranuclear gaze involvement occurs in Niemann-Pick, and a horizontal occurs in Gaucher's, and a down gaze paresis would again, in an elderly person and a slowly developing extrapyramidal syndrome, we would think of progressive supranuclear palsy, and Whipple's and ischemic stroke can also present with isolated down gaze paresis. So this video will show us oculomasticatory myarrhythmia. I'm sorry, it's not Wilson's disease, it is Whipple's disease. I'm sorry for the. So this is, so in oculomasticatory myarrhythmia, we have slow pendular convergent eye movements along with movements of the masticatory muscles. So this is a classical finding seen in Whipple's disease, also associated with vertical gaze or down gaze involvement. So then there are certain signs which help in localization of the lesion to the brainstem. For example, in an internuclear ophthalmoplegia, we know that it occurs with lesions of the ipsilateral medial longitudinal fasciculus. So if the right medial longitudinal fasciculus is involved on looking towards the left, the right eye will not adduct, but the left eye will show abducting nystagmus. So there are conditions like pseudo-INO. Pseudo-INO is may be seen in GBS, myasthenia gravis, but in pseudo-INO, convergence is affected. If convergence is spared, then this dissociation is seen in INO and not in pseudo-INO. At times, we may see a wall-eyed bilateral INO where there is associated exotropia. And there's also another condition known as Lutz posterior INO, where abduction is limited, but adducting eye shows nystagmus. So its localization value is debatable. Then there are INO plus syndromes. For example, the 1.5 syndrome, where along with the MLF, either the PPRF or the sixth nerve nucleus is involved, causing a gaze palsy, which is ipsilateral. So there is no horizontal movement on the affected side, and the other eye just shows abducting nystagmus. So this again localizes the lesion to the ipsilateral pontine tegmentum. Then there may be an associated facial palsy with 1.5 syndrome, and it's known as 8.5 syndrome, again localizing to ipsilateral pontine tegmentum. So this was another patient. So on looking upwards, asking to do an upward saccade, he had these converging, retracting type of movements. So this was a case of midbrain stroke. He also had an upcase palsy, lid retraction, and this convergence retraction nystagmus and a light near dissociation. So this was a case of Perinod syndrome, where we can find this tetrad, and it localizes the lesion to the dorsal midbrain. There are other syndromes wherein there is involvement of the nerves innervating the extraocular muscles along with long tract signs. I'm not going into the details. Let us look at this video. We come to ocular oscillations now. So if we look, this is a classical case of downbeat nystagmus, wherein in primary position, we can see downbeat nystagmus. So this increases in the down and out position, which is known as the Daroff sign. So this patient had basilar invagination, Arnold Chiari malformation, and a syrinx. So presence of a downbeat nystagmus indicates bilateral floccular involvement. One should always do an MRI of the cervicomedullary junction and look for a CVJ pathology. Then there are other syndromes like Bruns nystagmus, which localizes the lesion to the CP angle, seesaw nystagmus, which is seen in lesions at the mesodiencephalic junction, rebound nystagmus, which is seen in cerebellar lesions, and there are certain other ocular oscillations like inoculopalatal myoclonus, which may localize the lesion to the Guillain-Molleret triangle, and ocular bobbing, which may be seen in destructive lesions of the pons. So neuro-ophthalmological findings have a high neurotopographical value. So if we keep in mind the anatomic principles, have an astute observation and an accurate interpretation of these findings in the given clinical context, they can provide with us a precise localization and clue to underlying etiologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anu. Dr. Vivek, are you there? Dr. Vivek? I think all the there is a announcement because of the shortage of the time and it's too late. Lecture by Dr. Kiran Bala. It will be tomorrow. So I thank all the speakers for this wonderful session, and I hand over the proceedings to the organizers.
Thank you, everyone. We will now close the session for the day today, and we will meet again tomorrow at 8 a.m. for the sessions for day 3. We will continue tomorrow with Dr. Kiran Bala's talk, as we have been delayed for the sessions today. Thank you, everyone. Yes, ma'am?
Will you inform me the timings tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am. We'll call you and yes, ma'am. We will call you and confirm the time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's too late.
Sorry, ma'am.
Everybody must be feeling sleepy by now. It's okay. I won't mind. Let it be tomorrow.
Yes. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, chairpersons. Thank you, speakers.